Greetings. My name is Dr. Sung Lee. I am Director of Research for Brain State Technologies, Scottsdale, Arizona. And my apologies to you that I am not with you in person right now. I left my passport at home when I went to the airport this morning. Like many U.S. citizens, I feel such a kinship with Canadians naturally that it never even strikes me that I'm going to a different country. I know you may not feel the same way about U.S. citizens, but again, I apologize for not being there in person, and I hope this video will be followed by a phone call so I can answer any questions about some of the material I will be sharing with you now. So let me just give you a little bit of background. First of all, thank you to Glenna and to Brad for arranging this event. I think it's wonderful what they're doing, and I really hope that you will have a chance to learn more from them about brainwave optimization and to really go through with experiencing it, because ultimately this is, I believe, one of the greatest gifts that you can give yourself. So let me just give you a tiny bit about my background in case you're wondering why a medical doctor is engaged in a practice that seems very non-medical, and indeed it is a non-medical intervention. I have always been interested in ways to help the brain and body heal themselves. You might also say that I was interested in integrative or holistic healthcare modalities. I always believed in the potential and power of our own innate healing responses. And having that interest, I nonetheless went to medical school because I wanted to just understand the breadth of healing techniques. So I did train myself, or get training in internal medicine, the care of general adult medical health conditions. And I did fellowship training in what's called clinical epidemiology and health services research, which is a specialized research track which helps us to evaluate the efficacy of interventions and also look for the causation of disease, especially looking at populations and using special research designs or statistical tools and so forth. So what I ended up doing was applying that kind of research background to my interest in these integrative or holistic modalities. And so I have looked at a wide variety of, again, holistic interventions, and I've looked at the data behind them. I've looked at the effects of meditation, yoga, acupuncture, biofeedback, many forms of, again, inside-out healing, if you will. Now, I did that for a long time, and I was in academia, well, not such a long time, but I was in academia pursuing such a career, and I just wasn't satisfied. I wanted to explore more. I wanted to continue looking for just more efficacious options. I came from New York City to Arizona in 2005, and a few years later, someone introduced me to Brainwave Optimization because they knew of my interest in, again, holistic techniques. When I first explored brainwave optimization from the point of view of both a client and also soon thereafter from someone who was providing it to another individual, I quickly realized that this was a modality that just had a strong degree of efficacy, and I didn't need to do a study to have a sense of that, just my own clinical impression. And so it became rapidly of interest to me to see how we could generate the studies which would formally test my hypothesis that this did seem to be a modality with a lot of efficacy. And so I have been working for Brain State since 2010, and again now as the Director of Research, and I have been very pleased to work with Lee and Dr. Tegler of Wake Forest School of Medicine to design studies which are, some of which have been completed and which have reached the peer-reviewed medical literature and which are just helping us put some formal values or formal parameters, if you will, around what we have seen just every day on a kind of just real-life basis, that there's an efficacy here which is kind of special. So let me just tell you a little bit about what makes brainwave optimization special from a certain point of view. Okay, so there are lots of ways to appreciate this technique, but I just want to highlight one so that this can be a bit of a time for education, as well as just sharing with you about what Glenna and Brad do. So first of all, I'm sure that you appreciate that the brain is the most important organ of our body. Or if you don't appreciate it that way, I hope you will soon, because it is the most important organ of our body. We cannot transplant the brain. You can transplant many, in fact, virtually all our other organs. And so you have to keep and use the brain that you have now and take care of it well. So consider that in the United States, the decade from 1990 through 2000 was called the Decade of the Brain. Consider that recently our President Obama announced the Brain Initiative. So there's always been this appreciation, even at these sort of political levels, that, hey, we all need to come up to speed and appreciate that the brain is this critical organ of our life. And I'd like to offer to you that part of the reason why we have to keep emphasizing it is because there's a great deal that we don't know about it yet, and in many cases, even our very bright scientists have been kind of reaching in the dark trying to understand what's going on with the brain. So you'll hear all kinds of models of disease and health and all kinds of statements that reach the popular press about certain brain regions being enlarged or smaller in certain conditions, or maybe certain chemicals affecting the brain in a certain way, or how neurotransmitter levels are high or low in certain diseases, so on and so forth. It's probably very confusing to you. Even, again, a very specialized brain scientist will end up often not knowing what to make of all these different streams of data about the brain. And so, again, it's little wonder that it's hard for us all to really appreciate the brain when it just seems like such a confusing organ, so complicated and just hard to grasp, if you will, okay? So because of that complexity, I'd like to just, again, share one bit of education about the brain, which may be helpful for you in even just understanding your own everyday life and experience, and which furthermore may point up to you some of the value, again, of what Glenna and Brad are going to share with you more about brainwave optimization. And so I'm going to talk about one aspect of the brain function, and that is how it responds to stress. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with how it feels to be stressed. And you're probably familiar with something that's called the fight-flight response. That's when we're feeling aroused and we feel our palms get sweaty, we feel the heart racing, we feel the just the whole system being agitated and ready to move, right? So as you may know, that fight-flight response is also called in technical terms the sympathetic nervous system response. And this is, again, a system which has allowed us through evolutionary time to mobilize energy, again, to get into a fight or flight mode if we're either in danger or we otherwise just need to physically move ourselves. And it's been critically adaptive, valuable, helps us to engage complex environments, again, supports a large energy output, and really allows us to, to put the foot to the gas, the accelerator of the car, right? So you're probably also familiar with the idea that excess activation of that stress response over time is not so good for our health. And so you're probably, again, familiar with the idea that when that fight-flight system is activated over time, then that begins to look like a state that we call various forms of disease, whether that's anxiety or some kind of gastric irritability, that is some kind of digestive upset, or some kind of cardiovascular condition, palpitations or high blood pressure, so on and so forth. There are many, many conditions that have been associated with excess arousal in that fight, flight, or sympathetic nervous system response. Now, interestingly, that response system, the sympathetic fight-flight response system, is mostly mediated by the right brain. So that is an interesting fact, which personally I had not even learned in medical school because there aren't that many implications to it for most medical therapeutics. We don't give medicines that only affect one side of the brain, for example. But sure enough, that is the case. There are lots of different kinds of studies which show that the right side of the brain is the main manager of the sympathetic or fight-flight response. Now, having said that, I'd like you to be aware that there is another division of the autonomic nervous system, and that's the big broad category under which we have the sympathetic or fight-flight response. The other main division is called the parasympathetic nervous system, and it is essentially doing the opposite of those fight-flight responses. So it is calming the heart rate down, it is allowing digestion to occur rather than shutting off digestion, it is promoting uptake of energy stores rather than release of energy stores, and generally just, again, putting us into a more calm or less aroused state. Okay, it's kind of keeping a gentle brake on the accelerator that we just talked about. Okay, so we have these two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Again, the sympathetics for a fight-flight or arousal response, and then we have the parasympathetic division for what has been sometimes called the rest or digest response. Okay, so far so good. Now, just as we talked about the right hemisphere being largely the mediator of the fight-flight or arousal response, the sympathetics, interestingly, it is the left hemisphere which largely mediates the parasympathetic or rest-digest response. Okay? And so we have these two main divisions of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic, being managed by the two sides of the brain, the right and the left, respectively. Now, one more piece of education. Interestingly, the parasympathetic nervous system is not only mediating what you might call a rest and digest response, just putting a gentle brake on our arousal system. There's also an ancient division of the parasympathetics, which is doing something which is much more like a shutdown mode. If you stay with the car analogy, it's kind of like yanking on the emergency brake. It's just completely shutting things down. It's immobilizing you altogether. And it is, again, just something you might call a freeze state even, okay? And so rather than, again, just allowing you to get into a state of calm of your arousal, just gently braking your gas, rather it's just putting you into a freeze state, and that freeze state is actually probably coming about when you've had enormous stress that you can't even escape, or that you're otherwise feeling not competent to handle. And so that's kind of like being the deer in the headlights, right? Or being just frozen in fear, okay? And this is a response system that's kind of a last resort, again, when we're just in this kind of overwhelmed state, and which can reflect a kind of a stress, which again is not a state of calming of arousal. It's not just a brake on the accelerator, but again, rather is just a very primitive shutdown mode, okay? So if you followed what I shared so far, we have the right side of the brain mediating the sympathetic nervous system, fight, flight, arousal, and you have the left side of the brain mediating the parasympathetic nervous system, which is again for rest digest responses, but also a freeze response, just shut down when you're in a state of overwhelming stress. Now, what are the implications of these different systems and these different sides of the brain that manage them? Well, as it turns out, from what we have seen from looking at literally thousands of brain patterns of people who've used our technology, is that people who are in an acute fight-flight mode will, as you might have predicted, have a relative dominance in the right side of the brain. People who are in a kind of a freeze mode because they've had an overwhelming stressor, because they just don't feel like there was anything they could do to manage their stress, they may go into a freeze mode, and they may be left hemispheric dominant. So that is one of the key ways in which stress or trauma is just a severe or acute form of stress, can actually show up in brain patterns. And you may not have appreciated that from popular press stories, and actually 99% of neuroscientists that I've encountered don't appreciate that either. But that's just because that information hasn't really been emphasized, because no one really, again, is either making medicines for one side of the brain or the other, or just doing other kinds of procedures just for one side of the brain or the other related to our stress in particular. And so this is really a novel finding that we have appreciated, Lee, Gertis, and Peter, and others here at BrainState, that different kinds of stress will show up as different kinds of dominance in the right and left hemispheres. Again, a kind of an acute fight-flight response, hyperarousal will tend to show up as a right side dominance. Being in a freeze state where you're in a shutdown mode, that will tend to show up as a left side dominance in the temporal lobes in particular. The temporal lobes are where we have this kind of window into the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So the upshot of that then is that, well, you might ask yourself, is there some way to help someone who has become stuck in one of those stress modes? And we all know people who just seem like they're over-aroused all the time. They just can't calm themselves down. Or people who just sort of seem distant, emotionally numb, kind of like they're just shut down, both emotionally and socially, right? And they're just essentially under-aroused, right? And what we have found is that those kinds of behavioral or experiential states do tend to correlate again to these right or left brain dominances respectively. And so the question becomes, is there some way to help a person release themselves from being stuck in one of those states or the other? And that is exactly where brainwave optimization comes in. The technology, again, that Glenna and Brad are sharing with you about this evening is all about helping the brain to unstick itself from these essentially maladaptive, rigid patterns based on a prior trauma or stress or habit or lifestyle or history or what have you. The brain has gotten stuck in one of these modes, high arousal or low arousal, again, because of these traumas or stresses, and it has, in some cases, a bit of a hard time just dynamically allowing itself to move and function in ways that reflect the current and new realities. In many cases, people simply aren't in those high arousal environments anymore, but the brain got stuck responding to that old pattern, okay? So again, so the idea here is to find a way to let the brain calibrate or adjust itself so that it is no longer in that stuck state. So here's where I'd like to share with you from some images here that, that just give a little bit of a taste of what this process is all about. So we see a woman who is in a fight-flight response. She's in high arousal mode, and this is, of course, not her actual brain assessment because she's a cartoon figure, but underneath her is what one might see in a person that's in that high arousal mode. The left side of this figure is the left temporal lobe, the left brain. The right side of this figure is the right temporal lobe, the right brain. And the top part of the figures are the higher frequencies of energy. The bottom part of the figure is the lower frequencies of energy. And it's a bit subtle, but you may notice that the right side in the higher frequencies, the energy is stronger. Those blue, dark blue and purple bands are just thicker up there. There's more energy there, and that reflects, again, a kind of a right side dominance in that high frequency zone. And so again, this is the brain substrate, if you will, of that kind of high arousal fight-flight response you're seeing on her, in her body and in her face and emotions. Interestingly, when you look at the bottom part of that graph, you'll notice that it's actually the left side that's much stronger than the right, and we see that too. There are all kind of mixtures of left or right dominance depending on which frequency range we're talking about, the high or the low frequencies. And furthermore, just by the way, we're only talking here about the temporal lobes after all. There are many other regions of the brain, and we also work with those in brainwave optimization, but just for the sake of discussion, I'm only showing the temporal lobes. And here's actually my daughter, Bella. She's now 6. She's probably about 4 in this picture. And when one does these sessions, it's completely non-invasive, easy, no stress, sitting in a comfortable chair, even more comfortable than the one you see here. And you just got the little sensors stuck on the scalp with conductive paste. You have little standard earbud headphones in the ears. They're listening to musical tones. It's about the easiest thing you can do, in terms of some way to support your own health. I can hardly think of it's easier than meditation. It's easier than doing a lot of things that I can imagine that people do for their wellness. So, and when one does that, the brain gets a signal. It gets these musical tones, which are representations of the client's own brainwave activity coming back to them through the ears, and the brain just gets a message. It's like the brain is looking into a sound-based mirror, and just like if I shave without a mirror, I get a certain kind of imbalanced result. Well, if I shave using a mirror, I'm much more symmetrical in the way I can groom myself. For the first time in history, as far as I know, the brain is being given this technological auditory mirror for itself, and it can just make its own self-adjustments because it's perceiving its own functioning. And by doing that, now we allow the brain to make its own adjustments, and lo and behold, down below we have a figure of what that brain might look like after doing BWO. Now there's much more symmetry, balance between the left and the right, and there is much more improved proportionation of energy. That means there's more harmony in the energy between the low and the high frequencies, okay? Just like a symphony orchestra, you want the high and the low frequencies to be in a good proportion. You don't want the violins of an orchestra to be too loud or too soft. You don't want the tubas to be too loud or too soft. And you don't want them to be equal because they need to have their own rightful sort of energy, if you will. And likewise, in the brain, we don't expect these high and low frequencies to be equal. They just need to be in a kind of their own self-optimized proportionation. And in this case, that is what is going on there with this client's brain. And though these do not connect, the top and the low figures, the left and the right do on the bottom. This is actually one client who started out with brainwave optimization with, again, this dominance on the right in the high frequencies and dominance on the left in the low frequencies. Within a few sessions, this client was very even on both sides, which with, again, much more just harmonious ratios of energy between the high and the low frequencies. So that is a bit about brainwave optimization. What is the upshot of this? Well, people can experience a whole lot of different benefits, and everyone is a little bit different. Everyone has different goals to begin with, and sometimes I like to say, just as a rising tide lifts all boats, balance and harmony in the brain, more symmetry between the hemispheres, more optimized ratios of power between the low and high frequencies can be associated with lots of different kinds of improvements, and we oftentimes can't even predict. And so this is not a medical technology, and that to me is actually the beauty of it, because it's allowing the brain to optimize itself and thereby just optimize, again, a range of issues on its own terms. When we use medicine, that can be a much trickier road, as I believe you're all well aware. And just as a brief final note, I'll mention to you that actually a lot of mental health professionals are also coming around to this same kind of an idea. Interestingly, just about 2 weeks ago, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health of the US, of the federal NIH, announced that they would no longer be interested in receiving grant applications which were focused on looking at mental health and illness through the lens of what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which has been the so-called Bible of mental health and mental illness by the psychiatric profession for a long, long time. And the reason they didn't want to do that is because they just feel that it has no biological validity. It is based on identifying or attempting to characterize mental health and illness based on a lot of crude and somewhat arbitrary descriptions without an appreciation, again, of the fundamental underlying biology. And we agree with that wholeheartedly, because what we see is that when people are feeling well, that tends to be associated with more balance and more harmony in the brain. And we don't particularly care about any individual disease diagnosis. We don't care to try to treat any of those individually or in particular. Rather, we just want to let the brain optimize itself, bring itself to balance and harmony, and let these issues sort themselves out on their own terms. So I hope that this has been a useful introduction. And again, I hope that all of this is working out as in such a way that I'll soon be talking to you live from an airport, perhaps this evening. If not, then again, my apologies, and I do hope that Glenna and Brad are able to give you more of the full story of brainwave optimization and can also answer your questions. I know that this is, again, an amazing gift that you can give yourself, and I hope that you will continue to learn more about it, and more importantly, to go ahead and just give yourself the gift. Thank you very much.